All right, we're in Acts chapter 22 tonight. The end of Acts 21 last week was a little bit of a cliffhanger. We left off right as Paul was standing on the stairway, and he beckoned with his hand for the crowd that was crying out in verse 36 of chapter 21 for his death. They wanted to do away with him, much the same way, and we even talked about the similarities with the crowd's reaction, the mob's reaction to Jesus. This was very similar in so many points to the mob's reaction to Paul. And all he was doing was going about, same as Jesus, doing good. God was backing up what he did with miracles and signs and wonders. And yet he was hated specifically by some Jewish folks that would even followed him to different cities to persecute him. So the end of chapter 21, he's being arrested. In chapter 22, we get a chance for him to tell a little bit about himself. And we haven't heard his story. This is what happened to him on the road to Damascus. So he beckons with his hand, and then verse 22, Paul begins to give his defense. And he says, "Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make unto you." And they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, and kept even the more silence as he talked. This is a big change. Remember, just a little bit ago, they were crying for his death. So then he tells them that he's a Jew, that he was born in Tarsus, that he learned at the feet of a Jewish scholar by the name of Gamaliel, a Jewish teacher, who taught him, as verse 3 says, the perfect manner of the law, and how he was a hater of the very gospel he was preaching now. Verse 4, I persecuted this way unto death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. Also the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound into Jerusalem to be punished. So he's really having a heart-to-heart with this crowd, and then he begins to tell them what happened as he was on that about 140-mile trip to Damascus. And it came to pass, as I made my journey and was on the come near to Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me, and I fell to the ground. And I heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? That's verse 7. And I answered and said, Who art thou, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. They that were with me, Paul says, saw indeed the light and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake unto me. Interesting. If you remember, that light, Paul had said earlier, was from heaven. And the men didn't see it, but they did hear, or they couldn't hear the voice, but they did see they saw the light. And he said, what shall I do, Lord? Verse 10. He said, Arise, go into Damascus, and there it shall be told thee of all the things which are appointed for thee to do. And when I could not see for the glory of that great light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came to Damascus. He's rehearsing the same story that we read about. And when Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there, came and said and stood and said unto me, Brother Saul, receive thy sight. And that same hour I looked upon him. And he said, The God of our fathers hath chosen thee, that thou shouldest know his will, and see that just one, and should hear the voice out of his mouth. For thou shalt be his witness unto all men in what thou hast seen and heard. And now why tarriest thou? Arise, be baptized, wash away thy sins, calling upon the name of the Lord. And it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance, and I saw him saying unto me, Make haste, get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. That's verse 18. And I said, Lord, they know that I am imprisoned and beat in every synagogue, they that believed on thee. And when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I was standing by and consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him. And he said unto me, Depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. So we hear the Damascus Road story. Remember, the distance between Jerusalem and Damascus was about 140 miles. This is actually Google Maps showing it with the names today. And how that's the road, that's the path. Whatever's about, you can figure it around. What's 130, 140 miles from us? That's how far the trip was as he's heading to Damascus. And again, this is modern day Israel now, with some of the modern day cities. Beirut, the capital Tel Aviv, right here. Underneath there's Jerusalem, of course, in Damascus, Lebanon, and the Gaza Strip is down a little lower. I think I can raise the map up a little. Yeah, you can see even a little bit more. And we go on down into Egypt. But that's the trip, and that's what Paul is describing, his journey, and how he lost his sight, heard a voice, saw a light from heaven, and he's telling them about this journey. This same crowd. Let's read on. Verse 22, and they gave him audience unto his word, and then lifted up their voice and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. What happened? What did Paul say that changed in an instant this captive crowd? One word: Gentiles. He elevated the Gentiles as being worthy to hear the gospel, the same as the Jews. And they're so prejudiced against Gentiles. Everything else he said, and it was a good story, and it seems like they were interested and enthralled by the text. But in verse 21, when he said the Lord told him that he was going to the Gentiles, they tuned him out. It reignited the anger toward him again, that they didn't even feel like he should live, verse 22 said. And they cried out, and verse 23, cast off their clothes, threw dust in the air. Man, talk about a reaction. That one word, Gentiles, outraged that mob to think that God's salvation could be given freely to the Gentiles. Once again, I'll use that same word. We see just how prejudiced they were against foreigners. The message of Jesus, clearly, from Paul and the New Testament, was you may come to God. Jew, Gentile, foreigner, high, low, rich, poor. It's open to everyone. They were not ready to hear that. Even the scholars that got upset should have seen a foreshadowing of this when the Israelites left Egypt. Do you remember that a mixed multitude went with them, Exodus says? So not just Jews left, but some of the Egyptians decided to go with them, and some other parties too. That was foreshadowing the inclusion of all people who were willing to obey the Lord, which was and is the only prerequisite. As I said, anyone can come, but it has to be through Christ. It has to be through Christ Jesus. So the Jews of that day did not quite have a problem with Gentiles becoming Jews. This is interesting. But they were incredibly offended about Gentiles becoming Christians, because that implied Jews and Gentiles were equal, and God treated them the same. And they had a fit over that. Interesting to note at this point, the rest of Paul's life, he'll now be in Roman custody. He'll never be a free man again. So the letters we read and whatever we study after this, certainly the rest of the book of Acts, we have seen the last of Paul as a free man. There'll be different times he's given different latitudes of being able to move around and speak and God showing him favor. but he will always be under Roman guard and under the care of Rome from now on. So, the speech didn't go over too well. Notice what happens now. They threw their clothes off, they threw dust in the air. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle and bade that he should be examined. I love how this is worded. Examined by scourging, that he might know why they cried against him. And they bound him with thongs. Remember Agabus prophecy? They bound him with thongs, verse 25. Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, he asked him, remember, Paul was very smart, very intelligent man. Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that's a Roman and uncondemned? Now, back in this day, someone could be whipped, okay? That's one thing. The type of punishment that Paul was threatened with was the same punishment that they used on Jesus. This was the whip. Leather thongs on the end. I don't know if you can see parts of sheep bone, sharp shards of sheep bone were included in the end of the whip to make it sharper. And then it had a lead balls and lead spikes in it. Piece of lead here, leather grip to hold on to, good sturdy wooden handle, and the whip itself was made of leather. So that was horrible. But that was the same. What they're threatening with is scourging. That's different than just being whipped. And that was the punishment that they were threatening Paul with. And Paul asked a question. Hey, I'm just curious. Almost matter. Is it lawful for you to whip or scourge a man that's a Roman and hasn't been through a trial? Verse 26. When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, take heed what you do. This man is a Roman. Never forget how big a Roman citizenship meant to somebody in that day. I mean, they were it. The Jews, they were under Roman dominion. Rome was in charge. Rome was in law enforcement. Rome was it. Rome was another one of those empires that lived in human history where it was said the sun never set on the Roman Empire. That meant as far away as you could sail, Rome had an outpost there, or had people there, no matter which direction you went. That's why it was called the Roman Empire, one of the most powerful empires ever existed. So to be a Roman citizen made you automatically exempt from a whole list of things, including being scourged, especially without a trial. So he goes and tells the chief. Then the chief captains come and said, tell me, art thou a Roman? Paul answered, yes. Verse 27. And the chief captains answered, with a great sum I obtained this freedom. He had to pay money for his status, but Paul said, I was freeborn. As a Roman citizen, it automatically entitled you to certain preferential treatment just because you were born a Roman citizen. It's very similar to our country's history of the automatic advantages we have had as a United States citizen. In times past, it would give you leeway with foreign countries. It would automatically get you off for a crime done overseas, but Americans were treated different because, in our country, two things with our country. We've been good to so many different people around the world for the last 200 years, and also money. We fund a lot of money and pay a lot of things for them, so American citizens have always held a bit of esteem. So understand, maybe that'll help us to understand what it was like when Paul said, I'm a Roman citizen, I was freeborn. Verse 29, then straightway they departed from him that would have scourged him. They use the word examine, it meant investigate, but it's being investigated while you're being whipped with that contraption. So, a person would oftentimes die. They wouldn't even live through it. Remember how we said we're surprised that Jesus lived through the scourging? Well, when you look at the tool they used, and unfortunately the vigor the person doing the whipping would go at their job. If they didn't do their job correctly, they'd be put in jail. So they had to really go at it. And as I said, quite different from even being beaten with a rod or a normal whip, which Paul had experienced. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, he talks about that. But this type of tool and this type of scourging, where they want to know answers, so they're asking you a question as they beat you, most men would, or a lot of men would either die or they'd be crippled after the scourging. So this was not the normal Jewish flogging, which was bad enough, but this was the dreaded Roman flogging. And it was a beating so severe that oftentimes the victim wouldn't live. So Paul reveals his Roman citizenship, and then right away they drop what they were going to do. Verse 29, the chief captain was afraid, because now he thought he'd be in trouble with the Roman authorities after he found out he was a Roman, verse 29 said, because he was afraid because he had tied him up, because he bound him being a Roman. So verse 30 says, the next day, because he would have known the certainty whereas he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands and commanded the chief priests and all the council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So they didn't let him, he's never going to be free again. They didn't let him loose, but they took off the hand chains and the thongs, as they called them, and they brought him down to have a talk. Let's all of a sudden now, because he's a Roman citizen, let's not be too hasty. Let's be civilized about this. Let's have a discussion with Paul the Roman. Okay? Comments?